Clara Whitfield picked up the peach cobbler she had made from the last fruit of her dead husband's orchard, walked into that churchyard, with her chin up, and watched every single chair at the table slide away from her. Not quickly, slowly, one by one, like she was something that carried sickness. She did not drop the dish. She did not turn around. She stood there in front of half of Willow Creek, Colorado, holding the only thing she had left to offer, and she did not make a sound. If you've ever been made to feel invisible in a room full of people, this story was written for you. Subscribe to this channel right now. Leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels, and stay with me until the very end. Because what happens next will remind you that the people who underestimate a woman like Clara Whitfield always end up regretting it. The cobbler was still warm when Clara set it on the far end of the table. She had wrapped it in her mother's blue cloth, the one with the small embroidered roses along the hem, because she wanted it to look like it came from someone who cared, not someone who was desperate. There was a difference, and Clara understood that difference better than most people understood anything about her. She had been awake since 4 in the morning. Not because she was anxious, though she was. Not because she was nervous, though she was that too. She had been awake because the peaches needed to cook slow, and she only had one chance to get it right. She had used the last of her sugar, the very last of it. And she had stood over that cast iron pan in the dark of her kitchen, with the one good candle she had left stirring, watching the fruit soften and the crust turn the right shade of gold, and she had thought, this is going to be enough. She had told herself that all morning. This is going to be enough. She was wrong. The church supper, beneath the cottonwood trees on the edge of Willow Creek, had been a summer tradition for longer than Clara had been alive. Her mother used to bring spiced apple bread. Her grandmother used to bring a pot of venison stew, so thick you could stand a spoon in it. Clara had grown up believing that table meant something, that it was a place where neighbors became something closer to family, where the heat of the Colorado summer softened people the same way it softened the earth. She had not been to the supper in 3 years. 3 years since she had left Willow Creek with Thomas Whitfield, her brand new husband, full of hope, and the particular kind of foolishness that only comes from being young and in love, and certain that everything was going to work out. 3 years since she had driven away in Thomas's wagon while the whole town watched. 1 year since she had come back alone. In that 1 year, she had learned something that nobody ever teaches you when you're young and foolish and hopeful. She had learned that a town will forgive a woman almost anything. Almost. What a town will not forgive is a woman who makes them uncomfortable. A woman who reminds them of things they would rather not see. A woman who is large and grieving and inconvenient, and does not have the good grace to disappear quietly into a back room somewhere and stop taking up space. Clara Whitfield was all of those things. She knew it. She had known it since the first week after she came back, when she walked into the general store and watched Martha Greer pretend to be deeply interested in a bolt of brown calico until Clara had finished buying her flour and left. She had known it the Sunday she sat down in the third pew, her family's pew, the one her father had sat in for 30 years, and felt the entire row shift away from her like water moving around a stone. She had known it. But she had come to the church supper anyway. Because Clara Whitfield was also stubborn in the way that only broken people who have chosen not to stay broken can be stubborn. A quiet, deep, immovable kind of stubborn. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that just keeps walking forward, even when every single signal in the world is saying turn around. She set the cobbler down. She smoothed the blue cloth. She looked for a place to sit. The table was long enough to seat 40 people, and by the time Clara arrived, most of the seats were already taken. Families clustered together the way they always did, the Greers at one end, the Holloways in the middle, the Prescotts near the preacher's wife. Children ran between the legs of chairs. Men talked about water rights and the price of beef. Women leaned close to each other and spoke in the particular tone that meant they were not talking about recipes. Clara walked the length of the table. She was looking for a face that would meet hers. A nod, a small wave, any signal at all that there was a place for her. Instead, she watched the chairs move. Margaret Holloway, who had borrowed Clara's sewing needle and thread, not 4 months ago, and had never returned them, picked up her chair and shifted it 6 inches toward her husband without looking up from her plate. Old Reverend Marsh's wife, Dorothy, a small, tight-lipped woman in a gray dress, turned to the woman beside her and said something quietly. The woman beside her glanced at Clara and then looked away. Henry Prescott, who had once shaken Thomas's hand at this very table and called him a fine man, found something extremely interesting about the pattern of wood grain on the table in front of him. One by one, slow as water finding its level. Clara kept walking. She reached the far end of the table, the very end where the wood was oldest, and the bench wobbled slightly because one leg had never been properly fixed, and she sat down. There were 6 empty chairs around her. She folded her hands. She looked at the cobbler she had brought sitting there in her mother's blue cloth, and she thought, I used the last of my sugar for this. She did not let herself feel it fully. She had learned how to do that, how to feel things just enough to register them and then tuck them away somewhere deep where they couldn't get at her when she needed to function. Thomas had called it her armor. He had meant it as a compliment, and she had taken it as one, though now she sometimes wondered if he had also meant it as a warning. Across the table, 2 women she had grown up with, Lucy Farrow and Anne Beaumont, were looking in her direction and speaking to each other behind raised hands. Clara did not need to hear the words. She knew the shape of them. She had been reading that particular shape for a year. There she is, the widow. Did you know her husband left debts? I heard she was hiding something. She never did fit in even before. Clara unfolded her hands. She picked up a fork. She was going to eat. She was going to sit at this table and eat and smile and not give a single soul in Willow Creek the satisfaction of watching her leave before she was ready. That was when Dorothy Marsh stood up. Dorothy was a small woman, but she had the particular authority that comes from being married to a man whom everyone is slightly afraid of disappointing. She moved through the churchyard the way important women always moved, like the air owed her a path. She stopped near Clara's end of the table. She did not sit. She spoke just loud enough for the people nearby to hear, which was the exact volume she always chose, because Dorothy Marsh had been doing this for 40 years, and she knew precisely how to make a thing land. Clara Whitfield, she said, I'm glad you came today. I want you to know that this community prays for you. Clara looked up. Thank you, Dorothy. It can't be easy. Dorothy's voice had the smooth, practiced quality of a woman who had learned to deliver wounds wrapped in sympathy. Carrying all of this, the debts your husband left, the questions about the mine. People talk, and I know that must be very hard for someone in your position. The table had gone quiet in that particular way. Tables go quiet when everyone is listening, but pretending not to be. Clara set her fork down. She looked at Dorothy Marsh with the steady, flat expression that people who had underestimated her always remembered later. My position, Clara said. Well. Dorothy's eyes moved briefly involuntarily to Clara's figure, just a flicker barely there, but Clara caught it, the way she always caught it. You've had such a difficult time, and you've come back here, and I think it's very brave given everything. The questions about Thomas, the circumstances of his death. His death, Clara said, was an accident. The mining company made that determination. Of course, Dorothy smiled. Of course they did. I just mean people wonder, Clara. When a man dies and leaves a wife with nothing but questions, people wonder. And the wondering does get loud sometimes. She patted Clara's shoulder. Just once. Then she moved away. Around the table conversations restarted a little too quickly, a little too brightly. The way conversations restart, when everyone has just witnessed something they are pretending they did not see. Clara picked her fork back up. Her hand was perfectly steady. She was going to eat. She looked at the plate in front of her, at the biscuits she had taken from the general serving dishes, at the slice of ham, at the beans. And she looked at her cobbler in its blue cloth, and she thought very carefully about not crying. She thought about it the way you think about a door you are keeping shut. You don't think about what's on the other side. You just think about the door. She had not been sitting there 5 more minutes when she felt it. Not a sound. Not a movement. More like a change in the air. The table went quiet again, but differently this time. Not the quiet of people pretending not to listen. The quiet of people who have genuinely stopped. Clara looked up. He was crossing the churchyard from the direction of the road. Tall, broad across the shoulders, in the way that comes from actual work, not from any kind of vanity. His coat was the dark color of something that had been washed many times and had faded to a shade that was neither brown nor black, but somewhere between the two, and it fit him like something he had owned for a long time and didn't think much about. His hat was low and weathered. His boots were covered in the particular red dust of the mountain trails north of town. I was not looking at anyone. He was looking at the table. He scanned the full length of it slowly, deliberately, and his eyes stopped when they reached the far end. When they reached Clara. He walked the entire length of the table. He walked past the Greers and the Holloways and the Prescotts and the preacher's wife, and all of the important people who had important things to say about the weather and the price of cattle and the particular failings of their neighbors. He walked to the wobbling bench at the far end where 6 chairs sat empty around a woman holding a fork like a weapon she hadn't decided whether to use. He looked at the empty chairs. He looked at Clara. "Mind if I sit here, ma'am?" His voice was low. Not soft. There was nothing soft about it, but low in the way of something that doesn't need to be loud to be heard. Clara looked up at him. She did not know this man. She had never seen him before in her life. He was watching her with an expression she could not immediately name, because it was not pity, and it was not curiosity, and it was not the careful neutral look of someone performing a kindness. It was something more direct than any of those, something that simply looked at her and saw her. "People will talk," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. He pulled out the chair beside her. "People talk when they got nothing better to do with their time," he said, and he sat down. He set his plate on the table. He picked up his fork. He looked calmly at the people around the table who were looking at him, and he said easily without heat, like someone stating the temperature outside, "I don't eat in company that abandons a person for sport." Nobody said anything. Clara stared at the man beside her. He looked over at her cobbler in the blue cloth. "Is that peach?" Clara blinked. "Yes. Haven't had good peach cobbler since I was about 16 years old." He nodded toward it. "My mother made it from scratch with the ones off our own trees. You make that yourself." "I did." "From your own trees?" "My family's orchard," she said. "What's left of it?" He nodded like that made sense. Like that was information that mattered. "Name's Elias Boone," he said. Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Clara Whitfield." He nodded. "You from here originally, Mrs. Whitfield." "I grew up here." She glanced briefly at the table around them at all the people who had decided she was invisible. "I've been away 3 years. My husband and we were up near Crestfield. He worked the mines up there." "Crestfield," Elias said. "He died about 14 months ago." She said it the way she always said it, plainly, without decoration, because decoration always made people uncomfortable, and she had learned to strip it away to spare them. "Mining accident," they said. Elias looked at her. "They said," he repeated. Clara went still. It was such a small thing. Just those 2 words. Just the particular way he said them, not asking exactly, but also not letting them sit where she had set them. "Yes," she said carefully. Elias did not push. He looked back at his plate, picked up his fork, and cut a piece of biscuit. "My sympathies," he said. "Losing a husband is hard. Losing him young is harder." He was 31. Elias said nothing for a moment. "That's too young," he said finally. "Yes." Clara looked down at her plate. "It is." Around them. The churchyard had slowly returned to noise. People talking, children, calling out, the sound of a fiddle, starting up somewhere near the old oak at the edge of the field. But the noise had a different quality now. It had the self-conscious quality of people trying to look like they weren't watching 2 people they were absolutely watching. Lucy Farrow had given up all pretense and was simply staring. Clara noticed. "You know you've made yourself the subject of considerable interest," she said quietly to the man beside her. Elias took a bite of his biscuit. "I imagine. They'll say you've got bad judgment." "Probably. Dorothy Marsh will tell the Reverend you've got no sense of propriety." Is Dorothy Marsh someone whose opinion tends to mean something in this town? Clara considered. She thinks it does. Elias looked across the table at Dorothy, who was watching him with the particular expression of a woman compiling information. She looks like a woman who spent a lot of years deciding what other people deserve, he said. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, that's exactly what she looks like." Elias turned back to his plate. Clara picked up her fork. For a long while they ate in silence, and it was a remarkable silence, not uncomfortable, not strained, not the kind of silence that demands to be filled. Just the silence of two people sitting beside each other and being willing to do that. Clara had not experienced that particular kind of silence in a very long time. After a while she said, "You live up here in Willow Creek. North of it. Got a place up on the ridge. Been there about 2 years now." He reached for his cup. "Raise some cattle. Do some repair work on cabins and fence lines when people need it. Keep mostly to myself." "You don't come into town much." "No." "Then how did you end up at the church supper?" He thought about it for a moment, like it was a genuine question that deserved a genuine answer. "Ran into Reverend Marsh at the dry goods store last week. He invited me. Said it was a community gathering." He looked at the table. "He wasn't wrong about that part." Clara followed his gaze. He wasn't wrong. It was very much a community gathering. "What were you doing at the dry goods store?" she asked. "Picking up wire for a fence I'm mending." He took a drink from his cup. "What were you doing at the church supper?" Clara was quiet. "Trying to belong somewhere," she said. It came out more honestly than she had intended. More honestly than she usually allowed herself to be with anyone, because she had learned that honesty in this town was something people took and used and handed back to you at the worst possible moment. But she had said it. And Elias Boone did not take it and examine it and use it. He just nodded. "That's a fair reason," he said. Clara looked at him. "You're a very strange man, Mr. Boone." He almost smiled. It wasn't quite a full smile, just a slight shift at the corner of his mouth. "I've been told that before. By people who meant it as an insult. Mostly. I don't mean it as an insult." "I know," he said. "I can tell the difference." They sat together until the shadows from the cottonwoods stretched long across the grass and the supper wound down around them. Women began collecting dishes, and children began collecting themselves, and men began moving toward their wagons, and through all of it. Elias Boone sat beside Clara Whitfield at the wobbling end of the long church table and did not move and did not apologize for not moving. When people came to collect the serving dishes near them, they spoke carefully, politely, the way people speak when they are aware they have behaved badly and have not yet decided what to do about it. Margaret Holloway came to take the bowl that had been near Clara, and she looked at Clara's cobbler in the blue cloth and she said, Did you bring a cobbler?" "Clara." "I did," Clara said. "Is there any left?" Clara looked at the cobbler. She looked at Elias. Then she picked up the cloth and folded it open. There was more than half of it left. Because nobody had touched it. Because nobody had come to her end of the table. She cut a slice and put it on a clean plate and held it out to Margaret Holloway. Margaret took it. She ate a bite. She looked at Clara. "This is very good," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite an apology, and not quite an acknowledgement, and not quite anything that Clara was going to hold on to, but it was something. "Thank you," Clara said. After Margaret walked away, Elias said quietly, "Can I have a piece of that?" Clara cut him a piece. He ate it in 2 bites. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Whitfield, that is the best peach cobbler I have eaten in at least 15 years. Clara looked at him. For the first time in a very long time, longer than she could accurately measure, she laughed. It wasn't a big laugh. It was small and surprised and slightly rough from disuse. But it was real. Elias looked at her like that laugh was something he had not expected, and also something he was going to remember. "There it is," he said quietly. "There what is? I was starting to think the town had taken everything from you." He looked at her plate. "But they didn't take that." Clara looked down. She held the laugh somewhere inside her chest where it was warm. "No," she said. "They didn't take that. The sun was dropping behind the ridge when they finally rose from the table. Clara gathered her mother's blue cloth and folded it carefully. She picked up what remained of the cobbler, still half a dish, still warm, still perfect, and she held it in her arms. Elias walked with her toward the road. They did not speak as they walked. The churchyard noise faded behind them. The cottonwoods threw long shadows across their path. The evening sky above the ridge was going from gold to the particular deep blue that came just before dark in the Colorado mountains. At the edge of the churchyard where the grass met the road, Clara stopped. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For sitting there." He looked at her. "Wasn't a hardship," he said. "It will cost you," she said. "In this town, that kind of thing costs you." He looked back at the churchyard, at the last of the families, collecting their things and moving toward their wagons. "I've paid higher prices," he said. She nodded. She looked down at the cobbler in her arms. "Well," she said. "Good night, Mr. Boone." "Good night, Mrs. Whitfield." She started walking. She had gone perhaps 20 feet when he said behind her, "Mrs. Whitfield." She stopped, turned. Howe was still standing where she had left him, his hat in his hand, the last of the evening light cutting across his face. "What they said about your husband, about the circumstances." He paused. "Don't let them make that the story." Clara stared at him. She did not know what he meant. She did not know how he knew there was something more to mean, but something in the way he said it. The same way he had said they said earlier with that slight deliberate weight told her that Elias Boone was not a man who chose his words carelessly. "Good night," she said again. She turned and walked home. She did not let herself think about what he had meant until she was inside her house with the door shut behind her, and the cobbler set on the table, and the blue cloth folded over the back of the chair. Then she opened the drawer beneath the kitchen counter. She reached past the spoons, and the candles, and the extra cord of twine. She put her hand on the journal. Thomas's journal. The one she had found hidden in the floorboards beneath their bed, 3 days after she had buried him. The one with the names and the dates and the numbers that she did not fully understand, but that she knew in the particular way that a woman who loved a man for 3 years knows things meant something terrible. The one she had been carrying alone for 14 months. She held it for a moment. Then she put it back in the drawer. She blew out the candle. She stood in the dark of her kitchen, and she listened to the sound of the Colorado night, the wind, the distant creek, the particular silence of the mountains when they are close enough to touch, and she thought about a man who had walked the full length of a table to sit beside her, and who had looked at her husband's story and said simply quietly, "Don't let them make that the story." And for the first time in 14 months, Clara Whitfield thought, maybe I'm not as alone with this as I thought. Outside the ridge was dark against the sky. Somewhere up on that ridge in a cabin, she had never seen a man was riding home through the mountain dark. And she did not know yet what that meant. But she knew in the quiet, stubborn, unshakable place inside her that had kept her walking forward, even when every single signal in the world had said to stop that she was going to find out. The next morning, Clara was already at the fence line before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. She had been out there since first light, her hands wrapped around the wire stretcher, her boots in the mud from the irrigation ditch that had been leaking for 2 weeks. The fence was not the worst problem on the farm. The worst problem was the water wheel, which had been making a sound like a broken tooth grinding against itself since May. And before that, it was the barn roof. And before that, it was the eastern field that had gone hard and cracked because she hadn't been able to afford to work it properly. The problems on this farm lined up behind each other like people waiting at a counter patient and endless and certain that their turn would come. She did not think about Elias Boone. She told herself that. She focused on the wire. She had fixed 3 posts and was working on the 4th when she heard the sound of a horse on the road. She did not look up. People rode past the Whitfield farm every day. Most of them did not slow down, and the ones who did were usually checking to see how badly things had deteriorated since the last time they passed, storing up fresh material for conversations she would never be invited to. The horse slowed. Clara kept her hands on the wire. The horse stopped. She looked up. Elias Boone sat on a dark bay horse at the edge of her fence line, and he was looking at the water wheel. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Clara. "That wheel's about to lose the secondary brace," he said. "I know. If it goes, you'll lose pressure to the upper field. I know that too." He got down from the horse. Clara straightened. "I didn't ask for help, Mr. Boone." "No, ma'am, you didn't." He tied the horse to the fence post she had just repaired and walked toward the wheel. "I'm just looking." "People in this town look plenty," she said. "It's the only thing most of them do for free." He crouched down beside the wheel's lower bracket and ran his hand along the brace. "I've got some spare iron at my place on the ridge," he said. "Cut right, it would reinforce this. Wouldn't take more than a morning." Clara looked at him. "That's charity," she said. "That's a trade," he said, and he stood and looked at her steadily. "I believe I owe you one." She frowned. "You don't owe me anything. We shared a church supper. That doesn't make us even for anything." "Not the supper." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small piece of worn leather, a harness strap cracked and repaired with careful stitching. "Last December, you found a horse on your road, dark gray, bad cut on the right foreleg. You cleaned it and wrapped it and left grain." Clara stared at the strap. She remembered the horse. She remembered the gray the way it had been trembling at the edge of her fence line in the middle of a snow that was coming down sideways. She had brought it into the barn and cleaned the wound by lantern light, and in the morning it was gone. She had never known whose horse it was. "That was your horse," she said. "Name's Graywall, and that cut would have gone septic." He tucked the strap back into his coat. "He's fine now. Working horse. I need him." He looked at her water wheel. "So, not charity. A debt I've been meaning to settle." Clara was quiet. She looked at the wheel. She looked at the upper field still green, but thinning at the edges, in a way that told her the water pressure was already starting to drop. She thought about pride, and she thought about practical sense, and she had a brief internal argument with herself that she resolved very quickly, because she was a woman who had learned in the past 14 months that pride was something you got to keep right up until the moment it killed you. "All right," she said, "but I'm helping. I'm not standing by watching." "Wouldn't expect anything else," Elias said. He went back to his horse and began unlashing a set of tools from his saddlebag, and Clara looked at him for a moment with the particular expression of a woman recalibrating her understanding of a situation, and then she went back to her fence wire. They worked through the morning without much talk. That was something she noticed about Elias Boone. He did not fill silence the way most people did. Most people treated silence like a problem to be solved. Elias treated it like weather. Something that came and went and didn't require commentary. He fixed the water wheel brace in 2 hours. He did it cleanly and precisely, and without asking her where she kept anything, because he figured it out himself, which was a quality Clara noticed and filed away without comment. When he was done, he wiped his hands on a cloth and stood and looked at the wheel running smooth, and Clara said, "Thank you." And he said, "Yes, ma'am." And then neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Clara said, "You want coffee?" He looked at her. "I've got some," she said. "It's not much, but it's hot." "Coffee would be fine," he said. She went inside, and he followed at enough distance to make clear he was waiting for an invitation, which she gave with a slight motion of her hand at the door. He took his hat off before he stepped inside. She noticed that too. The kitchen was small and clean, in the particular way of places where someone has very little and takes great care of what little they have. Elias sat at the table without being asked twice, and put his hat on his knee and looked at the room without making a project of it. Just taking it in, the way a quiet person takes things in steady and without comment. Clara poured coffee. She set a cup in front of him. She sat down across the table. For a moment, they just drank. Then Elias said, "How long has the farm been in your family?" "My grandfather built the house. My father worked the land until he couldn't anymore. He passed it to me when he died 2 years before Thomas and I left for Crestfield." She looked at her cup. "I thought Thomas and I would come back to it together, eventually, when the mining work gave us enough to fix it up properly. And instead you came back alone. And instead I came back alone." She did not say it with self-pity. just with the flatness of a fact that had been turned over enough times to lose its sharp edges. Elias set his cup down. "The mining company," he said. "Crowley's outfit." Clara went still. "That's who Thomas worked for," she said carefully. "I know." He looked at her. "Benjamin Crowley runs 3 operations in this part of Colorado. Crestfield is one of them. I've heard his name a few times since I've been up on the ridge." "What have you heard?" Elias considered this for a moment, and she had the sense he was choosing between a shorter answer and a longer one, and deciding which one she could handle, and she was about to tell him she could handle considerably more than he probably assumed when he said, "I've heard that men who work for Crowley tend to have accidents when they start asking the wrong questions." The kitchen was very quiet. Clara looked at her coffee. She thought about the drawer beneath the counter. She thought about Thomas's handwriting, small and careful and exact, filling page after page with names and dates and numbers that she had read so many times she could recite them, but that she did not fully understand, because Thomas had been the one who understood numbers, and she had been the one who understood people, and together they had been complete, and now she was only half of what they'd been. "What kind of questions?" she said. Her voice was even, deliberate. Elias looked at her steadily. "Questions about where the safety money went," he said. "The fund Crowley collects from the miners every month. Supposed to go to families when men get hurt or killed." He paused. "Except the families aren't getting it." Clara set her cup down. Her hands were very still on the table. "How do you know about this?" she said. Not a question. More like something she was saying out loud to help herself think. "I spent 4 years working claims before I came up to the ridge," Elias said. "New men in Crestfield. 2 of them got hurt bad in a collapsed spring of '79. Their wives never saw a cent of the fund." He watched her face. "I started asking around. Couldn't get answers. Eventually I stopped asking and came up here." Something passed across his face. "I shouldn't have stopped." Clara looked at him for a long time. He met her eyes and waited. She got up from the table. She went to the drawer beneath the counter. She reached past the spoons and the candles and the extra cord of twine, and she put her hand on Thomas's journal, and she lifted it out, and she came back to the table, and she set it down in front of Elias Boone. He looked at it. He looked at her. "My husband's," she said. "He kept records, names, dates, amounts that went in and amounts that never went out. He had been documenting it for 8 months before he died." She looked at the journal. "He told me once that he was working on something important. He didn't tell me what because he didn't want me worried. He said when it was ready, it was going to change things." Elias had not touched the journal yet. "He died before it was ready," she said. "Yes, and you've had this the whole time." "I found it 3 days after I buried him, hidden in the floorboards under our bed." She met his eyes. "I've been carrying it alone for 14 months, Mr. Boone. I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know who to trust with it. The mining company made their determination, and the sheriff signed off on it, and the town here." She looked toward the window toward Willow Creek. "The town here decided who I was before I even arrived." Elias picked up the journal. He opened it. He read. He was a slow, careful reader. He did not skim. He turned each page with the attention of a man who understood that what was written there was not just information, but evidence, and that evidence had to be held properly, or it broke. Clara sat across from him and watched him read and did not say anything. After 20 minutes, he closed the journal. He set it on the table. He looked at her. "Clara," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and he said it the way you say a name, when you've just understood something serious about the person it belongs to. "This isn't just about your husband." "What do you mean?" "I mean the records here go back 4 years. Thomas wasn't the first one to document this." He put his hand flat on the cover of the journal. "There are initials here, notes in different ink. Thomas was building on someone else's work." Clara stared at him. Someone else was keeping records before him. Someone started it. Thomas continued it. He looked at her. Which means Crowley's men weren't just trying to stop Thomas. They were trying to stop a chain. He paused. "And they took his life to do it." The word landed in the kitchen like something dropped from a height. Clara had thought it. She had thought it in the dark alone 100 times. But she had never did it, because saying it made it real in a way that thinking it didn't, and real things required action, and she had not known what action to take. "They killed him," she said. Flat, certain. Elias held her gaze. "That's what this says," he told her. "And I believe it." Clara looked at the journal. She had carried it for 14 months, like a stone. She couldn't put down and couldn't explain. And now someone was sitting across from her, telling her that the weight of it was real, that she hadn't imagined it, that Thomas had died for something that was true. She had expected to feel relieved. Instead, she felt something colder. "Crowley," she said. "He's the most respected man in this county. He built the church hall. He funds the school. The sheriff plays cards with him on Friday nights." She looked at Elias. "Who is going to believe this?" "The men whose families never got the money," Elias said. "They'll believe it. They're afraid of him." "Yes." He looked at the journal. "But afraid men can be reached if the evidence is clear enough, if there's no room for Crowley to make it about something else." He looked at her. "Like whether the widow who's bringing the evidence can be trusted." Clara understood him. "He'll make it about me," she said. "He already has," Elias said quietly. "What Dorothy Marsh said yesterday at the supper. About the debts. About the questions. That didn't come from Dorothy." Clara felt something shift behind her sternum. Cold and certain. "Crowley," she said. "He knows you're here. He knows you came back. And he's been telling this town who you are before you had a chance to tell them yourself." Clara looked at her hands flat on the table. She thought about Margaret Holloway moving her chair. She thought about Dorothy Marsh's smooth, practiced voice. She thought about the way entire conversations had stopped when she walked into rooms for the past year, the way people's eyes moved to each other when she wasn't quite looking, the way she had always assumed it was grief making her paranoid. It wasn't paranoia. "He's been doing this for a year," she said. "Probably longer," Elias said. "Probably since before Thomas died, laying the ground so that if anything came out, the first thing people would think was consider the source." Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "What do we do?" Elias looked at her. There was something in his expression she could not name, something careful and serious, and underneath it, something else. Something that looked like the face of a man who has been waiting a long time for a reason to stop looking away. "First," he said, "we find out who started those records before Thomas. Because if there's someone alive who can corroborate what's in here, Crowley can't make it about you." He looked at the journal. "Thomas had to have known who it was. There's a name in here, not a full name, just initials. R.H. He paused. "You know anyone with those initials?" Clara thought. She thought carefully, moving through the people she knew. The people Thomas had known the names from, Crestfield and from Willow Creek, and from the years before. "Robert Hanley," she said. Elias looked at her. "Thomas mentioned him once. Only once. He said Robert was a man who knew how things worked inside the Crowley operation. That he'd been there from nearly the beginning." She met Elias's eyes. "Thomas said Robert had gone quiet about 2 years ago. He assumed Robert had just moved on. Where is Robert Hanley now?" "I don't know." She pressed her lips together. "Thomas stopped mentioning him after that one time. I didn't think much of it." Elias was quiet. "I might know how to find out," he said. Clara looked at him. "There's a man on the ridge," he said. "Older, name of Caleb Marsh. No relation to the Reverend, or at least none he'll admit to. He was a claim surveyor for about 20 years before his eyes went. He knows every man who ever worked a Crowley operation in this part of Colorado." He paused. "He's not easy to get to. He doesn't come down." "But you know him." "I've had coffee with him a few times. He talks to people he trusts." A slight pause. "He doesn't trust easily." "Will he talk to me?" Elias considered. "Maybe," he said, "if I bring you." Clara looked at the journal. She looked at Elias. She thought about 14 months of carrying a dead man's evidence alone. She thought about a year of being shaped by Benjamin Crowley's careful, invisible hands into a story that served him and destroyed her. She thought about Thomas's handwriting, small and careful and exact, and the 8 months he had spent documenting the truth before someone made sure he would never finish. She thought about what it meant to stop running. "When?" she said. 3 days, Elias said. "I need to send word ahead. Caleb doesn't like surprises." He stood, reached for his hat. "In the meantime, keep that journal somewhere better than a kitchen drawer." Clara looked at the drawer. She almost smiled. "How did you know it was in a drawer?" "Because that's where people keep things they haven't decided what to do with yet," he said. "You've decided. Find somewhere better." He put on his hat. He picked up his cup and brought it to the counter. She noticed that too, filed it away with the other things, and he walked to the door. He stopped. "Mrs. Whitfield." "Clara," she said. "If we're doing this, use my name." He turned and looked at her. "Clara," he said. "What Dorothy Marsh said yesterday. About the wondering. About the questions around Thomas's death." He held her gaze. "Has anyone in this town said that to your face before?" She thought about it. "No," she said. "They usually just imply it. But it's been there. It's always been there." Elias nodded. "Then understand something." His voice was low and steady. "The fact that Crowley needs to do this, needs to send his poison through Dorothy Marsh and her dinner table conversations, means he's still afraid. A man who wasn't afraid wouldn't bother." Clara looked at him. "He's afraid because the evidence exists," she said. "He's afraid because you exist," Elias said. "And you came back." He opened the door. Outside, the morning had moved on toward noon, and the sound of the newly fixed water wheel came through in a smooth, even rhythm, like something breathing properly for the first time in months. He stepped out. Clara stood at the door and watched him unhitch his horse and mount up, and she held the journal against her chest with one hand, and she thought about what it meant that a man she had known for less than 24 hours had just looked at the most dangerous thing she possessed and said, "I believe it." She thought about what it meant that she believed him. She went back inside. She took the journal and wrapped it in oilcloth and put it inside the cavity behind the loose stone in the fireplace where her grandmother had once kept her savings. Then she stood in her kitchen and thought. She thought for a long time. About Benjamin Crowley, who had built the church hall and funded the school and played cards with the sheriff on Friday nights. About Robert Hanley, whose initials were in her dead husband's journal, who had gone quiet 2 years ago, who might be anywhere or nowhere. About Caleb Marsh on the northern ridge, who didn't come down, who didn't trust easily, who might know where to find the thread that unraveled everything. About the way Elias Boone had read those pages slowly, completely, like each one mattered, and then looked at her and said, "This isn't just about your husband." She had known that. She had known it in the back of her mind for 14 months, in the place where she kept the things that were too large to look at directly. But knowing something in the back of your mind and saying it out loud at your own kitchen table were two very different things. It was real now. All of it. That afternoon, Clara walked into town. She walked with her chin up, the way she always walked when she was afraid, which was the opposite of the way most people walked when they were afraid, and which meant that most people in Willow Creek had no idea how frightened Clara Whitfield usually was. She went to the dry goods store. She needed flour and sugar, she was nearly out again, and a new length of cotton cord. Practical things. The kind of things a woman running a farm alone always needed. The store was run by Harold Sims, a thin man with excellent eyebrows and a tendency to arrange himself behind the counter in a way that suggested he was merely present by coincidence, when in fact he tracked every transaction in Willow Creek with the attention of a man who understood that information was currency. There were 2 other women in the store when Clara entered. She recognized them both. Ruth Pickering, who lived on the south side of town, and whose husband worked as a foreman at the local grain supply. And Vera Dunmore, who was perhaps 20 years older than Clara, and who had known Clara's mother, and who was, as far as Clara had been able to tell, the one person in Willow Creek who had not yet made up her mind about her. Ruth Pickering looked at Clara, and then at Vera, and then back at her flour measuring. Vera Dunmore looked at Clara and said, "Good afternoon, Clara," in a normal voice, the way normal people spoke to other normal people, and something in Clara's chest released slightly. "Good afternoon, Vera." Clara approached the counter. Harold Sims arranged himself with great casualness. "Mrs. Whitfield, what can I get for you?" "Flour, 2 pounds of sugar, 20 feet of cotton cord." "Of course." He began measuring. "Quite a supper yesterday." "It was. Saw you had some company." He was not looking at her, measuring flour with great precision. "The man from the ridge, Boone is it? That's his name. Don't know much about him, quiet sort." Harold Sims had the particular quality of a man who was telling you he knew very little in a way that communicated he knew a great deal. "Seems an odd match for a church supper, a man like that." Clara waited a beat. Then she said, "People surprise you." "They do indeed." He set the flour on the counter. "I heard he stayed quite a while, at your end of the table." "He did." "People noticed." "People tend to notice most things in this town," Clara said, "whether those things are their business or not." Harold Sims looked up at her. Clara held his gaze. From behind her, she heard a small sound. She glanced back. Vera Dunmore was watching her with an expression that was somewhere between amusement and respect. Harold Sims tied up her flour and her sugar and her cord. Clara paid. She turned to go. She was nearly at the door when Vera Dunmore said quietly enough that Harold wouldn't hear clearly, "Clara." Clara stopped. Vera had moved close to her. The older woman's voice was low and careful. "You know what Benjamin Crowley said about you at the mill meeting last month?" Clara went very still. "No," she said. "He said—" Vera glanced toward the counter, then back. "He said your husband had a habit of misunderstanding things. That men like Thomas sometimes got confused about how operations worked and started making accusations based on confusion. He said the mining company had been very patient with the whole situation." She paused. "He said he was worried about you, that grief does things to a person's judgment." Clara looked at her. "He said this publicly. At the mill meeting, 30 men heard it." Vera held her eyes. "He's building something, Clara. I don't know what, but he's been building it since before you came back. I thought you should know." Clara's hands were very still at her sides. "Thank you, Vera," she said. "Your mother was a good woman," Vera said simply. "I keep an eye out." Clara walked out of the store. She stood on the wooden walkway outside and looked at the street in front of her at Willow Creek going about its Tuesday afternoon. People moving in and out of buildings, a wagon rolling past children running along the far side of the road. Benjamin Crowley had been there at the mill meeting. Benjamin Crowley had been shaping the story for months. He had used Dorothy Marsh and Harold Sims and 30 men at a mill meeting, and God only knew who else in all of it. Every careful word was built on one thing. He knew she had the journal, or he suspected, or he was making sure that when the journal appeared, if it appeared, no one would believe the woman holding it. Clara walked back to her farm. She walked fast. When she got home, she went straight to the fireplace and checked the stone. The journal was there. She put her hand on it. Thomas's voice came back to her, not the way he'd sounded the last time she spoke to him, rushed and distracted, and already worried about something he wouldn't name, but the way he'd sounded years ago when they were young and everything was still possible when he'd said, "Clara, you see things clearer than anyone I've ever known. Don't ever let them tell you you're wrong about what you see." She closed the stone. She stood up. She thought about 3 days. She thought about a man named Caleb Marsh on the northern ridge. She thought about Robert Hanley's initials in the margins of her husband's journal. The thin thread of a man who had started something that Thomas had continued, and that she was now, whether she'd chosen it or not, going to finish. Outside, the water wheel turned smooth and even. The upper field was getting its water. Something at least was working as it should. She was going to need that field, because after the truth came out, and it was going to come out, she had decided that with the same quiet, immovable certainty with which she decided most things after it came out, she was going to need everything this land could give her to rebuild what Crowley had spent a year quietly taking apart. But first she was going to find Robert Hanley, or find out what had happened to him. And she was afraid in the cold, specific way of a woman who already suspected the answer that those two things might not be the same. 3 days passed, The way 3 days pass, when you are waiting for something that frightens you too fast in the daylight, when there was work to keep your hands busy, and too slow in the dark, when there was nothing between you and your own thoughts. Clara worked. She worked the fence line. She worked the upper field, turning the soil along the edges where it had gone hard and dry. She repaired the barn door hinge that had been hanging crooked since winter, and that she had been meaning to fix for 3 months. She did all of it with the focused, deliberate energy of a woman who understood that if she stopped moving, she would have to sit down with everything she knew, and she was not ready to do that yet. On the second night, someone tried to get into her house. She heard it at roughly 2 in the morning, a sound at the back door, not loud, not forceful, but purposeful. The careful sound of someone who knew what they were doing and believed she was asleep. Clara was not asleep. She had not been sleeping well for 3 nights. She lay in the dark and listened and did not move, and measured the sound where it was coming from. From how many, whether it was moving. It was one person, at the back. Trying the door handle first, then the window latch. She got up. She took the rifle her father had left her from beside the headboard. She walked to the back room. She said clearly into the dark, "I know you're there. I'm armed, and I am not afraid to use it." Silence. Then the sound of boots retreating across the backyard. Fast. No longer careful. Clara stood at the back window and listened until she could not hear the footsteps anymore. Then she went to the fireplace and checked the stone. The journal was there. She did not sleep again that night. In the morning she went to the backyard and looked at the ground. The earth near the back window had been disturbed. One clear boot print, large. A man's boot with a distinctive V-shaped wear pattern on the right heel. She looked at it for a long time. Then she went inside and made coffee and sat at the table and thought very clearly and very carefully about what it meant that someone had come in the night. It meant Crowley wasn't waiting anymore. It meant whatever she had 3 days to do, she now had less. When Elias rode up to her gate at dawn, on the 3rd morning, she was already standing at the fence with her coat on and her boots laced and the journal wrapped in oilcloth inside her coat against her ribs. He looked at her. He looked at the rifle she had set against the fence post. "Someone came to your door," he said. "Not a question. 2 nights ago, back window." His jaw tightened. "Did they get in?" "No." "Did you see anyone?" "Heard them. Saw a boot print. V-shaped wear right heel." She met his eyes. Crowley's not being patient anymore. Elias was quiet for a moment. He looked toward town the way he always looked toward it, like it was a thing he was measuring the distance of. "Then we move faster," he said. "Can you ride better than most men in this county?" Something shifted in his expression. "All right, let's go." The trail up to Caleb Marsh's place was not a road. It was a narrow track through the mountain scrub that only existed because someone who knew where they were going had walked it enough times to make it visible. Elias led. Clara followed on the second horse he'd brought, a steady, even-tempered bay, who seemed entirely unbothered by the angle of the climb, which Clara appreciated because she needed at least one thing around her to be unbothered. They rode in near silence for the first hour. Then Clara said, "Tell me about Caleb Marsh." Elias glanced back at her. "Old man, 70, maybe more. Spent his working life walking claim lines for mining companies all over the territory. Surveyed for Crowley about 12 years ago before he went independent." He paused. "He stopped taking work about 4 years back." "Why?" "He'll tell you why if he decides to." "You said he doesn't trust easily." "He doesn't." "What made him trust you?" Elias was quiet for a moment. "I fixed his roof 2 winters ago. It was that, or he was going to freeze." He paused. "He didn't ask me to. I just did it." Clara thought about firewood stacked beside a farmhouse door, about a note that said "not charity." "That's a habit of yours," she said. "What is doing the thing without being asked?" He didn't answer that. She hadn't expected him to. After another half-mile of climbing, Elias said without turning, "Clara, what I told you about my family, about the land they lost." He paused. I need you to know I'm not telling you that tonight when we see Caleb because I want his sympathy. He already knows it. I'm telling you now so you understand why I'm here on this mountain with you, instead of in a warm cabin keeping to myself like I've done for 2 years. Clara looked at his back. Why are you here? She said. I was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Because 2 years ago I stopped asking questions I should have kept asking, he said, and I've been carrying that. He kept his eyes on the trail. Thomas Whitfield kept asking, and someone made him pay for it. I'm not going to let them make you pay for it too. Clara held the reins and looked at the ridge above them and thought about what it cost a man to say something like that. The particular kind of cost that only comes from having failed at something you can't go back and fix. You couldn't have saved him, she said. No, Elias said. But maybe I can finish what he started. Caleb Marsh's place was a single-room cabin built low against the rock of the ridge in a way that made it look like the mountain had simply grown it there. A thin line of smoke came from the chimney. A mule stood in a small pen to the side, looking at them with the philosophical expression of a mule who has seen everything and is no longer surprised by any of it. Elias dismounted and tied both horses to the pen rail. Before he could knock, the door opened. Caleb Marsh was a short man who had been taller once. You could tell by the way he held himself the slight lean forward of someone whose spine had curved with age, but whose posture still remembered its original intentions. His eyes were pale gray and slightly clouded, but they moved across Clara with more precision than she expected from a man with failing sight. You brought someone, he said to Elias. I did. Woman. Yes. Caleb looked at Clara for a long moment. You're Thomas Whitfield's wife. Clara felt the ground shift slightly. You knew my husband. Knew of him. Come in. The inside of the cabin was ordered in the particular way of someone who has learned to compensate for limited vision, everything in its exact place, nothing out by even an inch. Caleb moved through it with perfect economy. He put a second chair at the table for Clara without asking, which told her that Elias had sent word ahead properly. He poured 3 cups of something that turned out to be a very strong herbal tea. He sat. He looked at Clara. Robert Hanley. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. Clara and Elias looked at each other. Yes, Clara said carefully. Do you know him? Knew him. Caleb wrapped both hands around his cup. Robert Hanley worked claim surveys with me for 11 years. Good man. Careful. The kind of man who noticed things other people walked past. He paused. He started noticing things about Crowley's safety fund records about 6 years ago. Small things at first. Numbers that didn't add up. Payments that were recorded, but that the families never received. He documented it, Clara said. He did. For 2 years he documented it. Quietly. Carefully. Caleb's voice was even, but under it was something old and heavy. Then he came to me. Showed me what he had. Asked me what I thought he should do. What did you tell him? I told him to be careful, that a man like Crowley had ears everywhere. He looked at his cup. I told him to find someone he could pass the records to, someone who wasn't connected to Crowley's operations directly, someone who could take it further if something happened to him. Clara's hands went cold. He found Thomas, she said. He found your husband, yes, about 4 years ago. Thomas was new to the Crestfield operation, honest, smart. Robert recognized the same quality in him that I'd recognized in Robert, the kind of man who couldn't unknow a thing once he knew it. Caleb paused. Robert passed everything he had to Thomas. His records, his notes, his calculations, with instructions to continue. Clara's voice was very quiet. Where is Robert Hanley now? Caleb looked at her with his pale, clouded eyes. Robert Hanley died in a claim collapse 18 months ago, he said. Crestfield Operation, Section 4. The company ruled it an accident. The room was completely silent. Clara sat with that for a moment. Then she said, like Thomas. Yes, Caleb said. Like Thomas. Elias had been sitting very still. Now he said, how many men? Caleb looked at him. How many men did Crowley use this way? Elias said. Accidents. Rulings. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. He turned his cup in his hands. That I can document, he said. 4. Including Robert and Thomas. He paused. That I suspect, but cannot prove 2 more. 6 men. Clara thought 6 men. 6 men who had known something, or started asking something, or found something they couldn't walk away from. 6 men who had died in collapses and accidents and circumstances that the Crowley Mining Company had ruled exactly what they needed them to be. She put her hand inside her coat and took out the journal. She set it on the table in front of Caleb Marsh. He looked at it without touching it. His clouded eyes moved across the cover. Thomas's, he said. His handwriting, his records. She paused. And Robert's in the earlier pages. Different ink. Caleb closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, something had settled in his face. Something that looked like the end of a long wait. What's in it, he said, is not enough on its own. Clara looked at him. What do you mean? I mean the records in that journal are Thomas's records, and Robert's. Both of them are dead. Crowley's lawyers, and he has very good lawyers. Clara, the kind you can only afford when you've been stealing from miners' families for 6 years, they'll say the records are fabricated. That a grieving widow and a mountain man with a grudge manufactured evidence. He paused. It won't be enough. Clara felt something tighten in her chest. Elias said, what would be enough? Caleb reached under the table. He brought up an old tin box, the kind used for keeping documents dry in the field. He set it on the table beside Thomas's journal. Clara stared at it. Robert gave this to me before he went back to Crestfield the last time, Caleb said. He said if anything happened to him, I was to keep it until someone came who had the rest of it. His hands rested on the lid. He said he'd know them by the journal. He opened the box. Inside a folded agreement. Heavy paper official. Signatures at the bottom. And beside it a ledger smaller than Thomas's journal. Older, the leather worn almost to nothing at the corners, with columns of numbers that matched line for line the entries in the fund records that should have gone to injured miners' families. And on the top page of the ledger, in a clear, careful hand, Benjamin Crowley. Authorized. Personal account. Transfer confirmed. Clara picked it up. Her hands were not steady. For the first time in 14 months, her hands were not steady. This is his signature, she said. Crowley's own signature, authorizing the transfers to himself. Yes, Caleb said. This is what Thomas was looking for. Yes. He never knew you had it. Robert didn't tell him. He was protecting Thomas. The less Thomas knew about this specific document, the less reason Crowley had to move against him quickly. Caleb's voice was quiet. It didn't help. They moved against him anyway. Elias leaned forward. Caleb, why didn't you take this to the sheriff yourself? Caleb looked at him. Because the sheriff had dinner at Crowley's house 4 nights before Robert died, he said. And because I am an old blind man on a mountain who has already watched 6 men die for knowing less than I know. He looked at Clara. I've been waiting for someone who had reason enough to use it and courage enough to survive using it. Clara looked at the signed ledger in her hands. She thought about Benjamin Crowley at the mill meeting, using 30 men to build a wall around her credibility before she could reach it. She thought about the boot at her back window. She thought about Dorothy Marsh's smooth voice delivering poison wrapped in prayers. She thought about what it meant to hold the thing that Crowley had killed 6 men to keep hidden. She thought about Thomas. She said, "There's a town meeting next Thursday. Benjamin Crowley will be there. The whole county comes, miners' families, the newspaper man from Glenwood." Elias looked at her. "The newspaper man," he said carefully. "James Aldrich. He came to Willow Creek about 3 months ago. I've seen him. He's not from here. He doesn't owe Crowley anything yet." She held Elias's gaze. If Aldrich sees this before the meeting, if he has time to look at it properly and understand what it is, Crowley can't call it fabricated if it's already been seen by a reporter, Elias said. And he can't disappear the evidence once it's been published. Caleb was watching them both. "You'd be moving in the open," he said to Clara. "Once you go to Aldrich, Crowley will know." "He already knows," Clara said. "Someone was at my back window 2 nights ago. He's known since I came back that I'm a problem. The only question is whether I let him solve it quietly or I move first." Caleb looked at her for a long time. "Your mother," he said finally, "was a woman who moved first." Clara looked at him. "You knew my mother. Knew her family. She was a Hartley before she married." He almost smiled. Not quite. The Hartley women have never been particularly good at staying quiet when quiet was the wrong answer. Clara looked at Thomas's journal and Robert's ledger, and Benjamin Crowley's signature clear and damning on a page that someone had already died trying to protect. She thought about 14 months alone. She thought about chairs moving away from her at a long table. She thought about Dorothy Marsh and Harold Sims, and a boot print with a V-shaped wear pattern at her back window in the dark. She thought about what Thomas had said years ago, in the good years, when everything was still possible. "Clara, you are the most stubborn, clearest-eyed person I have ever loved, and God help anyone who tries to make you doubt that." She put her hand flat on the ledger. "All right," she said. "We go to Aldrich." Elias nodded once. "We'll need to keep you somewhere. Crowley's men can't reach you before Thursday." "I'm not leaving my farm." "Clara, I am not leaving my farm." She met his eyes. "Thomas worked to save that land. My grandfather built on it. My mother is buried on it. I will not hand it over to Benjamin Crowley by walking away from it. If he wants me gone, he can try to do it in daylight where people can see." Elias looked at her. The expression on his face was something she still couldn't entirely name. But it had stopped being careful, and it had stopped being measured, and whatever it was now, it was direct. Something that looked at her the way Elias Boone looked at most things without flinching. "Then we do it from the farm," he said. "And I stay." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." He looked at Caleb. "You'll come down for the meeting." Caleb's face shifted. He looked out the small window. "I haven't been down in 2 years," he said. "I know. I'm an old man. I know that too." A long pause. "Robert was my friend for 11 years, Caleb said. "Thomas Whitfield kept his records when he didn't have to." He looked at the tin box. "I'll come down." They rode back down the trail in the late afternoon, the light going sideways through the trees above them. Clara had the journal inside her coat, and the ledger in the saddlebag wrapped in the oilcloth that had held the journal for 14 months, and she rode with both hands steady on the reins, and her jaw set, and her eyes ahead. Halfway down, Elias said, "You all right?" "I'm thinking." "About what?" "About James Aldrich." She kept her eyes forward. "I've seen him in town 3 times. He's young, younger than I expected for the job. He writes fast, and he listens to everything. And he hasn't yet learned to perform the kind of deference that men learn to perform for people like Crowley." She paused. "That's either a strength or it'll get him killed." "Probably both," Elias said. "I need to approach him carefully. If Crowley has eyes in town, and he does, we both know he does, I can't walk up to Aldrich on the street." "How then?" Clara thought. "Vera Dunmore," she said. "She warned me about the mill meeting. She's known Aldrich's landlady for years. She can arrange something private." She paused. "Vera's one of the few people in this town I trust not to sell the information before I can use it." "You're sure about her?" "I'm sure she knew my mother," Clara said. "And I'm sure she looked me in the eye without flinching. In this town right now, that's enough." They came down off the ridge as dark was gathering. Elias rode with her to her gate and dismounted when she did, and tied both horses while she went inside and checked the fireplace and the back door and every window in the house. Everything was where it should be. She came back out. Elias was sitting on the fence rail, his hat on his knee, looking at the upper field in the last of the light. Clara stood beside him and looked at the same thing. "When I first came back," she said, "I thought the hardest part was going to be the farm, the work, doing it alone." She paused. "I was wrong." "What was the hardest part?" "Watching people decide who I was." She looked at the field. "And not being able to show them the truth because I didn't know yet if I was brave enough to use it." Elias was quiet. "Are you brave enough now?" he said. Clara thought about it honestly, the way she thought about most things. Not performing the answer, but actually checking it against what she knew about herself. "I don't think it's about brave," she said. "I think it's about what you're willing to lose." She turned and looked at him. "I've already lost Thomas. I've already lost a year of my life to what Crowley built around me. I've lost the version of myself that believed if I just stayed quiet and worked hard and didn't make trouble, it would eventually be enough." She held his gaze. "There's nothing left to lose that I'm not already prepared to lose." Elias looked at her for a long moment. "That," he said quietly, "is the bravest thing I've heard anyone say in a long time." Clara looked away. Something in her chest was doing something she didn't have a practical word for, and she was not going to examine it at this particular moment, because there was too much else to examine, and she needed to stay functional. "You should stay in the barn," she said. "Not the house. People will talk enough as it is." "The barn's fine. There's a cot in the tack room, blankets on the second shelf. I'll find it." She started toward this door. "Clara." She stopped, turned. He was still on the fence rail, hat in hand, and the last light was doing something to the ridge behind him that she refused to notice because she was not going to be distracted by the landscape right now. "What Robert Hanley started," he said. "What Thomas continued. What Caleb's been holding." He paused. "You're the end of that chain." "I know," she said. "They couldn't stop it. Crowley couldn't stop it." He looked at her directly. "Because he didn't account for you." Clara held that. Then she said, "He's about to." She went inside. She barred the door. She stood at the kitchen table with the oilcloth package and Thomas's journal, and she opened the journal to the last page. Thomas had written the last entry. The handwriting slightly rushed, as though he'd been writing quickly, as though somewhere he had known he was running out of time. It said, "If you're reading this, Clara, it means I ran out of time to finish it myself. I'm sorry. I'm sorry it comes to you this way. But I always knew if it came to this, you were the right one to carry it. You were always the right one. I just hoped you'd never have to." She had read it 100 times. She read it again. She closed the journal. She looked at the door, at the dark outside the window, at the fire burning low in the grate. Thursday was 4 days away, somewhere in town. Benjamin Crowley was making plans he believed she couldn't counter. Somewhere on the ridge, Caleb Marsh was deciding how to get himself down a mountain for the first time in 2 years. And in her barn in the tack room on the cot beside the second shelf, a man who had walked the full length of a church table to sit beside her was getting ready to spend the night between her and whatever came next. Clara pressed her hand flat on Thomas's journal one more time. Then she went to the window and looked out at the dark. She was not afraid. She was something harder than afraid. She was ready. 4 days. Clara had 4 days between the ridge and Thursday, and she used every hour of them the way she used most things that frightened her, by moving through them so fast that fear didn't have room to settle. The morning after they came down from Caleb's, she sent word to Vera Dunmore through the only method in Willow Creek that didn't go through Harold Sims's store or Dorothy Marsh's kitchen. She left a folded note inside the hollow of the old post oak at the south end of the Dunmore property line, the same place her mother and Vera had passed messages to each other for 30 years when they didn't want the town knowing their business. She did not know if Vera still checked it. By noon, there was a folded note back. "Come to my back door tonight, 9 o'clock. Come alone." Clara showed the note to Elias. He read it and handed it back. "You trust her," he said. "I trust she hated Benjamin Crowley before I had a reason to." "That's a different thing." "No," Clara said. "For this, it's exactly the same thing." She went alone, as the note said. 9 o'clock. Vera's back door. The older woman had tea already poured, and James Aldrich already seated at her kitchen table, looking at Clara with the particular focused attention of a young man who has been told something interesting is about to happen, and is trying to appear more patient than he is. I was younger than Clara had expected. 25, maybe 26. Sharp eyes, quick hands, the kind of face that hadn't yet learned to compose itself into the careful neutrality of a man who'd been in the territory long enough to understand who you didn't look at too directly. He looked at Clara directly. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said. "Vera tells me you have something I need to see." "I have something everyone needs to see," Clara said. "The question is whether you're the right person to see it first." He tilted his head. "What makes someone the right person?" "They're not afraid of Benjamin Crowley," she said. "And they haven't been here long enough to owe him anything." Aldrich looked at her for a moment. "I've been here 3 months," he said. "In that time, Crowley's offered me a standing invitation to Sunday dinner, the use of his office for my dispatch work, and the very strong suggestion that the mining beat in this county would be much more productive if I understood who the important people were." He paused. "I haven't accepted any of it." "Why not?" "Because men who offer that much want something larger in return," he said. "And I'm not in the business of being owned." Vera set her teacup down and said nothing, which was the sound of a woman who had already made her assessment and was waiting for the other two to catch up. Clara opened her coat. She put Thomas's journal on the table. She put Robert's ledger beside it. She put the signed agreement, Crowley's signature, the transfers, the authorization directly in front of Aldrich. He looked at the documents. He looked at Clara. He picked up the ledger. He read the way Elias had read, slowly, completely, but with a different quality. Elias had read it the way a man reads something that confirms what he already feared. Aldrich read it the way a reporter reads something that is trying to tell him whether it's real, measuring every line against everything he knew and everything he didn't. He read for 20 minutes without saying anything. When he looked up, his face had changed. "These transfers," he said. "Column 4 going back to 77. They match the public fund assessments Crowley reported to the county office." "Yes," Clara said. "Except the fund assessments show the money going to injured miners' families." He looked at the signed agreement. "And this shows it going to Crowley's personal account." "Yes." "Authorized in his own hand." "Yes." Aldrich set the ledger down very carefully. "The way you set down something fragile that you have just realized is also explosive." "The man who kept these records," he said. "Robert Hanley." "Dead," Clara said. "Crestfield collapse 18 months ago. Company ruled it accidental." "And your husband?" 14 months ago. Same ruling." She held his gaze. "Robert started the documentation. Thomas continued it. Neither of them lived to finish it." Aldrich looked at Crowley's signature for a long moment. "Who else knows you have this?" "Elias Boone, Caleb Marsh, you, Vera." She paused. "And whoever sent someone to my back window 2 nights ago." Aldrich looked up sharply. "Someone tried to break in." "Tried. Didn't get in." She met his eyes. "Which means we are running on whatever time Crowley decides to give us before he tries again with more than one person." Aldrich was quiet. He looked at the documents spread on Vera's kitchen table, and Clara watched him making the calculation she needed him to make, the calculation between the story and the risk, between what it meant to publish this and what it meant to walk away from it. "If I write this," he said slowly, "I need it solid before Thursday. I need it verified, sourced, and documented so tight that Crowley's lawyers can't find a single thread to pull." He looked at her. "And I need Caleb Marsh on record." "He'll come down Thursday," Clara said. He agreed. "An old blind man who hasn't left his mountain in 2 years is your corroborating witness." "An old blind man who has 11 years of professional surveying experience inside Crowley's operations," Clara said. "And who personally received these records from Robert Hanley before Robert died. His testimony establishes chain of custody." Aldrich stared at her. "You've thought this through," he said. "I've had 14 months, she said. "I've had nothing else to do." Something shifted in Aldrich's face. Not pity, she was grateful for that. Something more like the recognition one person gives another when they realize they've been underestimating them. He looked at Vera. Vera looked back at him with the serenely unhelpful expression of a woman who had already done her part. He looked back at Clara. "All right," he said. "Thursday, town meeting. You present the evidence publicly. I'm there with everything already documented. Crowley can't suppress it after it's been said in front of the county." He paused. "But you need to understand what happens when this goes public. He'll come after me. He'll come after everything. Your land, your reputation, your husband's name. He'll use every tool he has, and he has considerable tools." Aldrich's voice was not unkind, but it was direct. "Are you prepared for that?" Clara looked at Thomas's journal. She thought about the last page, about the handwriting that had gotten slightly rushed toward the end. "You were always the right one. I just hoped you'd never have to. I've been living inside what he built around me for a year," she said. "I am not afraid of him doing it louder." She gathered the documents. She wrapped them back in the oilcloth. She stood. Aldrich stood too. "One more thing," he said. "The boot print, at your back window. V-shaped wear on the right heel." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small notebook. He flipped to a page and turned it toward her. On it was a rough sketch of a boot print, the same V-shaped wear pattern. Clara went very still. "Where did you see that?" she said. "Outside the dry goods store," Aldrich said. "2 weeks ago. I was documenting something else and I noticed it because I notice things." He paused. "It belongs to a man named Decker, Pete Decker. He's Crowley's property manager. Handles situations when Crowley needs them handled quietly." Clara stared at the sketch. "Crowley sent Decker to my house," she said. "Which means Crowley knows you're a threat," Aldrich said. "And he's already moving." Clara folded the notebook page back and handed it to him. "Then we move faster," she said. It was the same thing Elias had said on the mountain, and she understood now why he'd said it. Not because faster was always better, but because when someone like Crowley was already in motion, the only answer was to be further along than he expected. She told Elias about Decker when she got back. He listened without interrupting, which was the thing she had come to depend on about him, the way he received information. As information without performing shock or alarm, just taking it in and integrating it. "Decker," he said. "I know that name." Clara looked at him. "He was at the Crestfield operation the year I was there," Elias said. "Crowley's fixer. He was there the week of the collapse that took Robert Hanley." He paused. "He was also there the week before." The implication sat between them. "He didn't just report accidents," Clara said. "No," Elias said. Clara sat down at the kitchen table. She put her hands flat on the surface. "Then he's not just a threat to the evidence," she said. "He's evidence himself. If Aldrich can place Decker at both Crestfield collapses." "It changes what this is," Elias said. "It's not just fraud. It's 6 men," Clara said quietly. "It's 6 men." The word for it sat in the room unspoken because speaking it would make it a different kind of real, and they both needed to stay functional. Elias went to find Aldrich the next morning. Clara did not go with him because 2 of them going would draw more attention than 1, and she had something else to do. She went to see the miners, not the foremen, not the supervisors, not the men who ate dinner at Crowley's table, and came away with the easy confidence of people who had decided which side of a line they were on. She went to the families. She went to Ellen Grady, whose husband had lost 3 fingers in a Crowley operation 2 years ago, and who had received exactly $40 from the safety fund. $40 for 3 fingers and 6 months of recovery when the fund should have paid $400. She found Ellen at home with 4 children and a husband who still couldn't grip properly, and who looked at Clara with the expression of a man who was not going to be surprised by anything, but who had stopped expecting anything good. Clara sat at their table. She did not bring the documents. She was too careful for that. She simply said, "I need to know if you'd be willing to say publicly what the fund paid you. What it should have paid. Whether you signed a paper saying you'd received full compensation." Ellen's husband looked at her. "Why?" "Because I have something that proves where the rest of the money went," Clara said. "But a ledger is just numbers, unless there are people behind the numbers who are willing to say what those numbers cost them." A long silence. "He'll come after us," Ellen said. "He'll try," Clara said. "But there will be a reporter in that room on Thursday, and a crowd, and Crowley can do a great deal of things quietly, but he can't do them in front of a reporter and a crowd without it becoming something he can't contain." Ellen looked at her husband. Her husband looked at his hand at the 3 missing fingers at the scarring on his palm. "What time Thursday?" he said. Clara visited 3 more families that day. 2 of them said yes. One of them shut the door in her face, and she did not blame them, because fear was a rational response to a man who had already demonstrated what he was willing to do. By Wednesday evening, she had 4 families willing to stand up. 4 families. Caleb Marsh, James Aldrich, a signed ledger, a dead man's journal, and a mountain man sleeping in her barn. It felt like enough. It also felt terrifyingly thin. She was standing at the fireplace Wednesday night, looking at the stone behind which she'd kept the journal for a week when Elias came in from the barn. He knocked before he entered, which he always did, and she called him in, which she always did, and there was something about that small repeated ritual. The knock, the call. The door opening that had become in the space of 4 days. Something she did not examine too closely, because she was still trying to stay functional. He sat at the table. She poured coffee. He said, Aldrich confirmed Decker at both sites. He found a 3rd man who'll testify to seeing Decker at Crestfield the week before both collapses. Clara set down her cup. 3 sites, she said. I thought there were 2. Elias was quiet for a moment. Aldrich found a 3rd collapse, he said. Earlier. 78. Different operation, but same pattern. Crowley affiliated. Same ruling. Man named William Sears. He looked at her. His wife is still in Crestfield. She never moved. She's been waiting for someone to ask. 7 men. Not 6. 7. Clara pressed her hand flat on the table and breathed. Aldrich is bringing her testimony in writing, Elias said. Notarized. A friend of his in Crestfield arranged it. Good, Clara said. Her voice was steady. She made it steady. Good. Elias looked at her. Clara. He said her name the way he'd said it the first time, like something that deserved the full weight of attention. Tomorrow is going to be... He paused. Hard, she said. Yes. I know. Crowley will be there. He always comes to the town meetings. He considers them his stage. Elias's voice was even. When you walk in with those documents, he's going to try to make the room about you before you can make it about the evidence. He's going to use everything he's built this past year. Everything Dorothy Marsh said. Everything Harold Sims repeated every conversation at every dinner table. And he's going to turn it all toward you at once in public to see if you break. Clara looked at him. I know, she said again. You won't, he said. Not reassurance. Statement. No, she said. I won't. He looked at her the way he had looked at her that first evening, directly without the performance of looking, without the careful, managed quality of a man trying to show you something. Just the direct, unguarded attention of a person who had decided that you were worth seeing clearly. She looked back. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then she said, Elias, your family, the land they lost. She held his gaze. Was it Crowley? He was quiet. Not Crowley, he said. Different man, same type. He turned his cup in his hands. My father had a claim, good land, water on it. Man named Pritchard decided he wanted it. He had a lawyer, and my father didn't, and the law in that county bent the way it always bends when one man has money and another doesn't. He looked at the table. My mother and my sister moved to my uncle's place. My father went into the mountains and didn't come out. He paused. Not the way I came into the mountains. The other way. Clara was very still. I'm sorry, she said. I spent 2 years after that trying to find a legal path, something that would reverse it. Some record, some error, something Pritchard had done wrong that could be used. His jaw tightened. There was nothing. He was too careful, or the law was too cooperative, or both. He looked up at her. I stopped looking, came up here, told myself it was enough to live away from all of it. It wasn't enough, she said. No. He met her eyes. Watching what they did to Thomas, to Robert Hanley, to all of them, something moved across his face. It wasn't enough to just live away from it. Clara looked at him. This man who had walked the full length of a table because she was sitting alone. This man who had fixed her water wheel because his horse owed her a debt. This man who had ridden up a mountain and sat with a blind old surveyor and then ridden back down and slept in her barn 4 nights running because somewhere in the 2 years he'd spent trying to be far enough away from the world's cruelty, he'd discovered that far enough away didn't exist. You could have stayed on your ridge, she said. I know. You didn't. No, he said quietly. I didn't. She looked at her coffee. She thought about Thomas, about how much she had loved him, about the particular shape of grief that came from losing someone who saw you completely and understood that the two of you were better together than you were separately. She thought about how that grief had changed over 14 months from something sharp and constant to something more like a scar present permanent, no longer bleeding but there. Part of the landscape of who she was now. She thought about what it meant that she was sitting across a kitchen table from someone else who simply quietly, without drama or expectation, saw her. She was not ready to examine what that meant, but she was honest enough to know it was there. "Get some sleep," she said. "Tomorrow's going to require everything we have." He stood. He picked up his hat. At the door he stopped. "Clara, whatever happens tomorrow." He turned. "You're not alone in that room." She held that. "I know," she said. He went out. She sat at the table for a long time. Then she went to the fireplace and took out the journal and the ledger and Crowley's signed agreement, and she put them inside her coat, all of it flat against her chest, where she would feel it with every breath she took. She was not going to leave them in the house tonight. Not with Pete Decker still somewhere in this county with his V-shaped boot heel and his Crowley-signed instructions. She kept them on her person, and she sat in the chair by the door, and she dozed in short stretches, and she woke with her hand automatically checking that they were still there, and they were every time flat against her ribs like a second heartbeat. In the morning she washed her face and combed her hair and put on the best dress she owned, not the finest she'd ever had, but the one that fit her properly, the dark blue one that her mother had helped her make the year before she died, the one that was neither apologetic nor showy, but simply honestly her. Elias was at the gate when she came out. He was wearing his good coat. The one that wasn't the faded traveled thing he wore on the mountain, but the dark wool one that fit him across the shoulders, and that told you quietly that this was a man who knew the difference between a mountain trail and a county meeting. He looked at her. "Ready," he said. Clara checked the documents inside her coat one last time. She looked at her farm, the repaired fence, the working water wheel, the upper field, still green, the barn door, no longer hanging crooked. All the small fixed things that together added up to a life she had rebuilt from nothing with her own two hands. She looked at the ridge above town where Caleb Marsh was already making his way down for the first time in 2 years, moving slow and steady on the trail he still knew better than anyone. She looked at Elias. "Yes," she said. They walked into town together. And the moment they appeared on the main street of Willow Creek, Clara Whitfield, in her mother's blue dress, with her chin up and her hand steady, and Elias Boone, one half step to her left, with his hat on and his shoulders square. The street went quiet, in a way that streets go quiet, when people understand without being told that something is about to change. People stopped. People watched. Dorothy Marsh came out of the milliner's and saw them, and her face did something complicated that she quickly rearranged into her usual smooth composure, but not quickly enough for Clara not to catch the original expression. It was fear. Not the fear of a guilty conscience, though perhaps that too. The fear of a woman who had placed a careful bet on who had power in this county, and was now watching the odds shift in real time. Clara met her eyes. She did not look away. Dorothy Marsh was the one who looked away. And then they were at the town hall, and the doors were open, and inside Benjamin Crowley was already there. Of course he was. He was always early to these things. He considered early arrival, a form of ownership, standing near the front with his good suit and his easy smile, and the particular quality of a man who has never in his life had a room turn against him. He saw Clara. His smile held. But something behind his eyes moved. Clara walked to the center of the room. She reached inside her coat. She put her hand on the documents. She was ready. The town hall of Willow Creek seated 80 people comfortably and held perhaps 110 that Thursday morning, because word had moved through the county the way word always moves in small places, not in straight lines, but in the particular sideways current of whisper and implication that meant half the people in that room did not know exactly why they had come. Only that something was going to happen, and they did not want to miss it. Benjamin Crowley stood near the front, the way he always stood at these meetings, slightly apart from the crowd, slightly elevated on the low platform, reserved for speakers, with the easy settled authority of a man who understood that ownership of a room was established before anyone called it to order. He was 61 years old, and he had spent 40 of those years learning exactly how much space a man could take up before other people started pushing back, and he had spent those 40 years making certain he never took up quite that much. He saw Clara come in. His smile did not change. But he moved. Just slightly. Just a shift of weight, a repositioning, the kind of small adjustment a man makes when he is recalculating without wanting anyone to see him do it. Clara saw it. She walked to the center of the room, and she stopped, and she looked at the people around her. The miners and their wives, the shopkeepers, the families she had visited, the faces that had looked away from her for a year, and she felt the documents flat against her ribs, and she thought with complete clarity, "This is it." This is the moment Thomas ran out of time before he could reach. She was going to reach it for him. Reverend Marsh called the meeting to order from his usual chair near the window. He was a tall man with a precise voice and the habit of beginning every public gathering with a prayer for community and discernment. And Clara let him do it, standing where she was, head slightly bowed, hands at her sides. When he finished, he looked at the room. "Before we begin today's scheduled items," he said, "I understand there is a matter of community concern that has been brought to my attention. I've been asked to allow a speaker to address the assembly." He paused. He did not look comfortable. "Mrs. Clara Whitfield has requested the floor." The room shifted. Not loudly. Just a collective small movement, the turning of heads, the exchange of glances, the particular rustle of a crowd that has been waiting for something without knowing what it was. Crowley's easy expression held. "I do think," he said from his position near the front, in the voice of a man making a reasonable suggestion, "that perhaps we ought to follow the meeting's usual order first and—" "I'll hear her," said a voice from the back. Clara looked. It was Ellen Grady's husband, still standing near the door, his damaged hand visible at his side, his face set. "So will I," said another voice. Then another. Then a fourth. The four families. All of them standing. Crowley looked at them. Something moved behind his eyes, the recalculation again faster now, and less successful at being hidden. "Of course," he said smoothly. He spread his hands. "Of course. Clara, please." He said her name, the way men like him said the names of people they had already decided to dispose of, with a warmth that had nothing under it. Clara walked to the front of the room. She stood before 110 people, and she felt every one of them looking at her, the way this town had been looking at her for a year, as a story they had already been told, a conclusion they had already been handed. She was going to give them a different story. "Most of you know who I am," she said. Her voice was steady and clear, not loud. She did not need to be loud. "I'm Clara Whitfield, Thomas Whitfield's wife. I grew up in this town. My grandfather built the farm on the South Road. My mother is buried on that land." She paused. "For the past year, this town has been told a story about my husband. That he was careless. That he was confused. That he made accusations out of grief or misunderstanding. That his death was an accident, and that I came back here carrying nothing but debts and questions that decent people shouldn't entertain." She looked at Dorothy Marsh, who was sitting in the third row, with her hands folded and her face arranged, and her eyes fixed at a point just to the left of Clara's face. "That story," Clara said, "was constructed, deliberately, by the man standing near the front of this room." Crowley moved. "Now, Clara," he said in the tone of someone managing an unstable situation. "I understand grief does—" "Sit down, Mr. Crowley," Clara said. The room went absolutely silent. No one had ever said that to Benjamin Crowley in a public room in 40 years. The silence that followed had a particular quality. The stunned, held-breath quality of people witnessing something they had not believed was possible until they were watching it happen. Crowley did not sit down, but he stopped talking. Clara reached inside her coat. She brought out the oilcloth package. She unwrapped it on the speaker's table, slowly, deliberately, with the care of someone who understood that the weight of what she was placing there needed to be visible. Thomas's journal, Robert Hanley's ledger, Crowley's signed authorization. My husband Thomas Whitfield spent 8 months documenting the theft of the Crowley Mining Safety Fund, she said. Before him, a man named Robert Hanley spent 2 years documenting the same thing. Both of them are dead. Both of them died in what the Crowley Mining Company ruled as accidents. She looked at the room. I have their records. I have the ledger showing every transfer from the safety fund to Benjamin Crowley's personal account. And I have the signed authorization in his own hand approving those transfers. She held up the authorization. She held it up so the room could see the signature. Someone in the back said, "Lord Almighty." Crowley took a step forward. "Those documents." He said, his voice still controlled, but with something working hard under the control. "Now, were prepared by a woman who has every reason to want to damage my reputation and no credible... I'd like to speak." The voice came from the side door. Every head in the room turned. Caleb Marsh stood in the doorway. He was short and slightly bent, and his eyes were clouded, and he held himself against the doorframe with one hand, because the mountain descent had cost him. Clara could see that, could see the slight tremor of effort in his arm, but his voice was clear and carried the particular authority of someone who has nothing left to lose and has therefore stopped being afraid. "My name is Caleb Marsh," he said. "I was a professional claims surveyor for 22 years. I surveyed for Crowley Mining from 1869 to 1873. Robert Hanley was my colleague for 11 years. He moved into the room. People stepped back to make way. Robert came to me with his records before he died. He gave me the ledger that woman is holding. I have had it for 18 months. I have been waiting for someone to come forward with the rest." He reached the front of the room and stood beside Clara. He looked toward Crowley with his clouded eyes, and though he could not see him clearly, he faced him precisely the way a man faces a direction he has known for a long time. "I will testify to the chain of custody of these documents," Caleb said. "Under oath, in any court in this territory." Crowley's controlled expression was slipping. "This is..." He stopped, started again. "This is the word of an old man with failing eyesight and a grudge combined with the fabrications of a grieving widow, and mine," said James Aldrich. Aldrich stepped forward from the far side of the room, his notebook open, his press credentials visible on his coat. "James Aldrich, Glenwood Springs Courier," he said. "I've spent 4 days verifying these documents against County Records Fund assessment filings and the testimony of 3 independent witnesses. I have a notarized statement from the widow of William Sears, third collapse, 1878, also ruled accidental, also Crowley affiliated." He looked at Crowley. "I have confirmation from 2 former Crowley employees placing a man named Pete Decker at the sites of 3 separate collapses in the weeks preceding each one." The room erupted. Not in shouting, in the particular roar of 100 people trying to process the same information at the same time, which was louder and more chaotic than shouting because it had no single direction. Crowley's face had gone the color of old chalk. "Decker is a property manager," he said. "He visits sites regularly, that's his..." "The week before Robert Hanley's collapse," Aldrich said, reading from his notebook with the flat, unhurried voice of a man delivering facts. "Decker was seen inspecting the specific support braces in Section 4 that failed. The failure was later ruled structural deterioration." He looked up. "2 witnesses saw him there. Both have given written statements." Crowley said nothing. For the first time in 40 years, Benjamin Crowley said nothing. Clara looked at him. She had spent 14 months trying to imagine this moment, trying to imagine what it would feel like to stand in a room and watch the thing that had taken Thomas from her, that had shaped her into a story she had never agreed to tell, begin to come apart. She had imagined it would feel like triumph, or anger, or the particular sharp satisfaction of vindication. It did not feel like any of those things. It felt like grief clean and completed. Like a door finally closed on something that had been standing open in the cold for too long. It felt like Thomas. Like something Thomas had started, and she had carried the rest of the way to the place it needed to go. Ellen Grady's husband stepped forward from the back of the room. "The safety fund paid us $40, he said. Flat, clear. No anger in his voice, just the exhausted precision of a man who has been carrying a number in his head for 2 years. $40 for 3 fingers and 6 months of no wages. The fund assessment said $400 was collected. Where did the other $360 go? To his account, said the woman beside him. Her voice shook slightly, not with fear, but with the particular tremor of someone who has been holding something down for a very long time and is finally letting it surface. Our children wore the same shoes for 2 winters because we couldn't afford new ones. Our children. A second family stood. A third. A fourth. Each of them said a number. Each of them said what it had cost. Each of them stood in that room and made the ledger columns into something that had weight and breadth and consequence, and with every voice the room pressed closer, and the silence around Crowley widened like water pulling back before a wave. Sheriff Holt was standing near the door. How was a broad man who played cards with Crowley on Friday nights, and who had signed off on every accident ruling for 3 years, and Clara watched him across the room and saw the precise moment he made his calculation. The calculation between the man he'd been serving and the room he was standing in, between the way things had been and the direction they were now clearly going. He looked at Crowley. He looked away. He did not walk toward Crowley. He walked toward Clara. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said. His voice was careful, the voice of a man composing himself in real time. "I'd like to see those documents." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the Friday card games. She thought about the accident rulings. She thought about 7 men. She handed him the documents, not because she trusted him, because she understood that what mattered right now was not who held the documents, but that they existed in the open, in a room with a reporter and 100 people in a place where they could not be hidden again. Holt looked at Crowley's signature. He looked at the ledger. He looked at Crowley. "Benjamin," he said. Just the one word, just the name. But the way he said it was the way you say a name when a door has closed, and you are acknowledging that the room on the other side is gone. Crowley looked at the sheriff. He looked at the room. He looked at Clara. And for the first time, the smile was completely gone. What was under it was not rage, and it was not defiance, and it was not the righteous indignation of a wrongly accused man. What was under it was simply the face of someone who had built everything on the assumption that certain people would never have the power to stand up, and who was discovering in a public room in front of 100 witnesses that he had been wrong. "I want my lawyer," Crowley said. "Yes," Sheriff Holt said. "I reckon you do." 2 deputies came through the side door. Clara did not know if Holt had sent for them before the meeting or if he'd stepped out and sent for them during it. Either way, they were there, and the room watched them walk toward Crowley, and Crowley watched them come. And he did not run, because there was nowhere to run to. And he did not argue, because the argument was over, and the room held its collective breath as the man who had built himself into an institution in this county walked toward the door between 2 deputies with his jaw set and his eyes forward and his hands at his sides. He passed Clara on the way out. He stopped. She looked at him. "You have no idea what you've done," he said. Low, private, between them. "Yes," Clara said. "I do." He walked out. The door closed behind him. The room was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then it wasn't. Clara stood in the center of it and let the sound move around her. The voices, the questions, the particular noise of a community, discovering that the story it has been told about itself is wrong. And she held Thomas's journal against her side, and she breathed. Elias was beside her before she'd fully registered him moving. He did not touch her. He simply stood close enough that she could feel the steadiness of him, the same way you feel a wall when you put your hand out in the dark. Not something you're leaning on, just something that's there. "All right," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. She meant it. Vera Dunmore came through the crowd. She took Clara's hands in both of hers, and she said nothing for a moment, just held them, and Clara felt the age and warmth of those hands, and thought about her mother, and thought about the hollow post oak, and thought about the 30 years of small, careful kindnesses that had made it possible for her to be standing in this room right now. "Your mother," Vera said, "would be insufferably proud." Clara almost laughed. She would have been insufferable about it in general, she said. Vera squeezed her hands and let them go. Aldrich found her next moving through the crowd with his notebook, and the slightly stunned look of a young man who has just seen his first major story break in front of him and is already writing it in his head. "I need a formal statement," he said. "When you're ready. Not today if you don't need it to be today." "Tomorrow," Clara said. "Come to the farm." He nodded. He started to move away. Then he stopped. "Mrs. Whitfield." He looked at her with that direct, unguarded quality he had. "For what it's worth, I've been in this territory 3 months. I've been in 3 other counties before this one, and I have never seen anyone walk into a room carrying what you were carrying and hold it steady the way you did." He paused. "Thomas Whitfield made a good choice." Clara looked at him. "He made a lot of good choices," she said. "He also had very good judgment about people." Aldrich nodded. He moved away. The room was still loud around her, still churning with the particular energy of people rearranging everything they thought they knew about their town. And in the middle of it, Clara found a moment of quiet that was entirely internal. A stillness she had been looking for, without knowing she was looking for it, for 14 months. She thought about Thomas's last journal entry. "You were always the right one. I just hoped you'd never have to." She had had to. She had carried it, all of it, the journal and the grief and the year of being shaped into someone else's story, and the cold knowledge of what Crowley had done, and she had carried it to exactly the place it needed to go, and she had set it down. She was not done. She knew she was not done. There would be a trial, and there would be lawyers, and there would be more of Crowley's careful construction to dismantle, and there would be days when it would be harder than today. There would be 7 families who needed what the safety fund had taken from them. There would be the farm, always the farm, still needing work and time, and the slow, steady labor of a woman who intended to be there for a long time. But today was done. Today was finished, and it was right. She walked out of the town hall. The street outside was bright and warm, and she stood in it for a moment, and felt the sun on her face, and listened to the sounds of Willow Creek carrying on around her. A wagon, a child. A dog barking somewhere down the road. The ordinary ongoing sounds of a place that had just been changed and was still for the moment figuring out what that meant. Elias came out behind her. He stood beside her. They were both quiet for a while. Then he said, "What do you need to do next?" She thought about it. "Go home," she said. "Check the water wheel. Work the east fence." He looked at her. "That's it?" "That's everything," she said. "That's always been everything." He was quiet for a moment. "I could help," he said. Careful, direct, the same way he said most things. "With the east fence." Clara looked at him. She thought about a man who had walked the full length of a table, about firewood at her gate, and a note that said, "Not charity," about a mountain trail and a blind old surveyor and 4 nights sleeping in her barn. About the way he'd stood beside her in that room, not to carry her, but simply to be there, which was the thing she had learned that mattered most. She thought about Thomas, who had loved her completely, and whom she had loved completely back, and she thought about the shape that kind of love leaves in a person. Not a wound, not anymore, but a knowledge. A deep, permanent knowledge of what it felt like to be truly seen by someone, and what it meant when you started recognizing that quality in someone new. She was not ready to put a name to it, but she was honest enough to know it was there, and she was Thomas Whitfield's wife, which meant she had learned from the best that some things deserve to be walked toward, even when you can't see exactly where the path ends. "The east fence," she said, "has about 40 posts that need checking." "I've got time," Elias said. "It'll take more than a morning." "I know." She looked at the ridge above town, at the clear Colorado sky, above it, at the place where she had spent a week walking back and forth carrying everything she was toward the moment that had just happened. "All right then," she said. They walked back down the road toward her farm. The water wheel was turning when they arrived, smooth and even, the sound of it steady in the afternoon quiet. The upper field was green. The barn door hung straight on its hinge. The fence line stood solid along the south boundary. Small things. Fixed things. The accumulated evidence of a woman who had refused to let everything fall apart, even when everything was trying to. Clara stopped at the gate and looked at all of it. Elias stopped beside her. "It's a good farm," he said. "It is," she said. "It took me a year to see that clearly again." She opened the gate. She walked through. 6 months later, the trial of Benjamin Crowley opened in the county seat at Glenwood Springs, and James Aldrich covered every day of it for the Courier. And Caleb Marsh came down from his ridge for the second time in 2 years, and 7 families stood up in that courtroom and said their numbers, and the numbers added up to something that no lawyer in Colorado could make disappear. Benjamin Crowley was convicted of fraud, misappropriation of funds, and conspiracy in connection with the deaths of 7 men. Pete Decker was convicted alongside him. Sheriff Holt resigned before the trial began. The county appointed a new sheriff. He was a younger man from the western slope, and he had never played cards with anyone on Friday nights. And he came to Clara's farm one afternoon and said formally that the county was opening a review of every accident ruling connected to Crowley's operations going back 10 years, and that he wanted her to know. She thanked him. She gave him Thomas's journal. She kept the copy she had made every page in her own handwriting because she was Thomas Whitfield's wife, and she understood that some things needed to exist in more than one place. The safety fund was reconstituted under county oversight. The 7 families received full restitution. Ellen Grady's husband bought his children new shoes, and when he came to tell Clara, he was not a man who cried easily, but he held himself carefully, and he said, "Thank you." And she said, "Thank Thomas." And he nodded and said, "I do, every day." Clara rebuilt the farm. She opened the supply shop she had been thinking about since the day she walked back into Willow Creek with nothing but a suitcase and a stubbornness her mother had built into her like a foundation stone. She stocked it for miners, families, and struggling widows, and the people who needed practical things at honest prices, and she ran it with the clear-eyed, organized efficiency of a woman who understood accounts better than most businessmen in the county. Dorothy Marsh came to the shop 3 months after it opened. She stood at the counter. She looked at Clara for a long moment. "I owe you an apology," she said. She said it the way people say things they have rehearsed because they know they have to say them, but they are not fully comfortable with the saying. "What I said at the church supper, what I repeated, I was wrong." Clara looked at her. She thought about what she wanted to say and what it was worth saying. "Dorothy," she said, "I'm going to tell you the same thing I'd tell anyone in this town who spent a year letting Benjamin Crowley put words in their mouths." She held her gaze. "Remember how easy it was, and be more careful next time about whose story you're helping to tell." Dorothy blinked. She nodded. She bought her flour and she left. Vera, who had been standing near the back shelf, pretending to examine a bolt of cloth, waited until the door closed and then said, "Your mother would have said it exactly that way." "I know," Clara said. "I've been practicing." In the evenings after the shop closed and the farm work was done, Elias came down from the ridge. He had not moved to the farm. He had his cabin, his cattle, his independent mountain life, and she had her farm and her shop and her own fierce self-sufficiency. And neither of them was the kind of person who needed to collapse one life into another to make it real. But he came down. He ate supper at her table. He fixed things that needed fixing, not because she couldn't fix them herself. They both understood she could, but because he wanted to, and she had learned to let people do things because they wanted to, which was something she had been practicing for months and was getting better at. He stayed long enough that the sound of his boots on her porch became something she listened for in the early evening, and she was honest enough about herself to call that what it was. One evening in the late summer she made peach cobbler. The peaches were from her own trees. The first real harvest since she'd come back, since she'd had time enough and stability enough and sufficient water from the properly working wheel to let them come properly to fruit. She made it the same way she'd made it for the church supper. Slow, careful, from scratch with the last of her sugar. Except this time, she had more sugar than she needed, because the shop was doing well, because the farm was doing well, because she was doing well. She set 2 plates on the table. Elias came in, hung his hat on the hook by the door. He had a hook now, she'd put one there, and she had said nothing about it, and neither had he, and he sat down. He looked at the plates. He looked at her. "Peach," he said. "Yes." He ate a bite. He was quiet for a moment. "Still the best I've had in 15 years, he said. Clara looked at him across the table, at this man who had walked toward her when everyone else was walking away, who had chosen inconvenience over comfort, who had understood before she'd fully admitted it herself that the truth was worth carrying, regardless of what it cost. And she felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for a very long time. "Elias," she said. He looked at her. "I want to say something." "All right." "The church supper," she said. "The day you sat down." She held his eyes. "I thought I was past needing things from other people. I thought I had learned to need nothing. I thought that was strength." He waited. "It wasn't strength," she said. "It was just a different kind of being alone." He looked at her for a long moment. "Clara," he said, "you don't have to say anything back." "I know," he said. "I want to." He set down his fork. "I spent 2 years on that mountain telling myself distance was the same as peace, that I'd made something acceptable up there, something that was enough." He paused. "It wasn't enough. I just didn't have a reason to admit it until I walked into a churchyard and saw a woman sitting alone at the end of a table, holding a fork, like she was deciding whether the world deserved her." Clara looked at him. "Did it," she said, "deserve me?" "It does now," he said, "because you made it." The evening settled around them warm and certain, and the peach cobbler went slowly between 2 plates, and the water wheel turned in its even steady rhythm outside, and the upper field held its green in the last of the summer light, and everything that had been broken was not entirely mended, and everything that had been lost was not entirely recovered, because that was not how life worked, and Clara Whitfield had never been a woman who needed the world to be simpler than it was. But she had her farm. She had her shop. She had Thomas's name restored to what it had always been: a good man's name, a brave man's name, a name that belonged to someone who had died trying to protect people who needed protecting. And she had this: a table, 2 plates, a man who had learned that peace was not found in mountains, but in the particular courage of choosing to stay. Clara Whitfield had walked into Willow Creek carrying nothing but a suitcase, a stubborn heart, and a dead man's truth. She had sat alone at the end of a long table, and she had not broken, and she had not run, and she had waited not for rescue, but for the moment when everything she had been carrying finally became the thing that changed everything. She had been worth waiting for. She had always been worth waiting for. And now, in the warm quiet of her own kitchen, with the evidence of everything she had built surrounding her, Clara Whitfield finally, completely, and without reservation knew it.